Welcome. Thank you so much for your interest in the Research Consortium's presentation on the new US Standard Specification for Barrier Face Coverings. Today's presentation was created by Research Consortium founder, Richard Nicholas, a member of the American Society of Testing and Materials International Committee, that was overseen by the Center for Disease Control's NIOSH division, to create a national standard for general-purpose face coverings. While we are confident that this new standard will result in the improvement of overall face covering quality and enhanced consumer awareness, we believe that it will also, inadvertently, create many new long-lasting challenges for employers. Fortunately, this presentation addresses all of these topics. By the way, let me introduce myself. I am Brian Livingston. Along with my associate, Amy Brooks, we will virtually narrate today's presentation. If at any time you wish to pause or stop our narration, simply toggle the speaker icon below. With that, let's begin.
You are in good company, as representatives from each of the organizations shown have registered for one of our webinars. Most are purchasing, risk control, workplace safety and human resources professionals, like yourself.
Let's talk a little bit about the Research Consortium, what it is, and why it was formed. About 2 years ago, Richard Nicholas, a 40-year veteran of the healthcare industry and the founder of the Research Consortium, was approached to raise capital for an initiative aimed at introducing and promoting an exciting new type of DNA test. This test identifies which medications are good and bad for a specific person based on their genetic makeup. This is called pharmacogenomics. During the course of our work in this area, we learned that it takes a whopping 15 years, on average, for a new medical technology or health innovation to progress from the workbench into widespread clinical use. In great part, this is the result of the dismal state of our clinical trials process, something that has remained the same for more than 70 years. Indeed, it takes about $17,000 to recruit just one participant for just one phase of a clinical trial. As such, most clinical trials fail because they don't attract adequate participation. Few people are aware that the origins of today's health plans began with the passage of the Taft-Hartley legislation, some 75 years ago. That legislation enabled unions to bargain for employee benefits, and the managers of those plans became known as third-party administrators. Today, these TPAs manage health plans for more than 40 million Americans who are members of private, public and union-sponsored health plans. Because they are typically smaller, nimble and non-bureaucratic organizations, TPAs have proven to be excellent laboratories for identifying and evaluating new medical technologies, health innovations and new types of benefits. The Research Consortium believes that TPAs would be an excellent source of participants with which to conduct the translational research needed to bring more medical technologies to market sooner, and to help populate clinical trials. Each of the large health insurers have well-funded pharmaceutical therapeutics and medical technology assessment committees, comprised of medical experts, physicians and scientists. These committees are charged with identifying, evaluating and assessing new medical technologies and health innovations. Unfortunately, such committees do not exist in the TPA industry, largely because it is a more fragmented market sector. Understanding this, the Research Consortium was created by a group of seasoned health plan administration industry veterans, to fill this exact function, for the TPA industry. When the pandemic emerged, it greatly slowed our efforts as air travel had stopped, investment money dried up, and a more urgent need arose. Accordingly, when the state of New York announced that it would require employers to supply their employees with face coverings, we refocused our attention to the study of face masks, as our thought was to identify the best general-purpose face mask available on the market, and to leverage our vast TPA and health insurance industry contacts to distribute them to employers and health plan members, as a means by which to raise funds for our other research efforts. Unfortunately, we could not find an effective, safe and eco-friendly face mask, and, ultimately, we developed our own face covering, based on our extensive research. It is noteworthy to mention that the Research Consortium was not established to make its management rich. On the contrary, it was created with the intent to become a certified B Corporation, an entity that is based on social entrepreneurialism, and focused on harnessing intellectual capital, and hard work, to do large-scale social good, rather than generating profits.
To evaluate and assess face covering options, it is helpful to have a basic understanding of what they are up against, and how they are supposed to work. Understanding this, today's presentation will cover virus transmission, the important, but little-known concept of bioburden risk, and the need to kill, rather than just block, pathogenic microbes. Face covering efficacy will be discussed in the context of exposing the many false claims made about them, and myths about face covering materials, treatments, durability, safety and their environmental impact will be dispelled. Methods for comparing general-purpose face coverings, including the new standard's various requirements and performance measures, will be reviewed, as well as the standard's deficiencies as it relates to consumer advisory labeling. Lastly, we will review how the face covering standard will impact employer exposure, liability and compliance, and what may be done to best handle each. As it turns out, this presentation is both relevant and timely, as on February 15, a group of some of the nation's foremost epidemiology, fluid dynamics and disease transmission scientists, professors and physicians, wrote a letter to the leaders of the Biden administration's pandemic control team, to urge them among other things, to update and refocus their efforts on inhalation exposure, and to adopt and recommend the new face covering standard.
Please know that we are not epidemiologists, filtration scientists, textile engineers or experts in disease control or airborne transmission. The foundation of our knowledge of COVID-19, its transmission and face mask efficacy emanates largely from our extensive research into exactly this subject. More importantly, our study, originally an employer guide, starts with the proposition that face coverings should be expected to offer a meaningful degree of protection for the wearer. This is a position just recently adopted by the CDC. At 70 pages, and having 176 referenced citations, our research is comprehensive and well supported. Access to our study, as well as the several articles that we have published on this topic, may be gained at researchconsortium.org.
Extremely small, pathogenic viral microbes, which are not living organisms, typically attach themselves to hosts that are airborne transmitted. These larger hosts are called droplets and aerosols. Droplets are large particles that are typically generated from coughing and sneezing. Aerosols are extremely small, light particles that may be generated by speaking, and even just breathing. This distinction may be best visualized by thinking of droplets like rain, and aerosols like fog. Rain typically falls to the ground, whereas fog can float and be blown about. Moreover, unlike droplets, aerosols can remain suspended in air for long periods of time. This makes them much more noxious and potent. As this illustration shows, viral particles from a cough can travel as far as 16 feet, and those of a sneeze, as far as 26 feet. This very much calls into question the continued consideration given to the 6 feet social distancing convention. It is simply misleading, as it was created 75 years ago, before we understood aerosol transmission. Here is another way to illustrate droplet and aerosol transmission. The infected person at left projects a viral cloud comprised of both large droplets and small light aerosols. Some of the smaller droplets are projected, such that they may be inhaled by the nearby person at right, while the larger droplets will fall to the ground, before reaching the person. The illustration also shows how a second person, who is not too far in the distance, can readily become infected from aerosol particles generated by the infected individual. Given that infected aerosol particles can travel long distances through the air, in a cloud like fog, and remain suspended for extended periods, This article makes the case that the entire 6-foot physical distancing construct may need to be reimagined, to take into consideration a temporal dimension.
Here is one of several case studies that are referenced in our research. This exhibit illustrates the impact of wind on viral transmission, and demonstrates how easy it can be to become infected outdoors. Consider the following two situations given a baseline premise that with no wind, droplets typically travel less than 6 feet. As shown at top, with a slight 2.5 mph breeze, droplets can travel about 20 feet in 5 seconds, and remain suspended at heights from about 20 to 65 inches. As shown below, if the breeze is a more moderate 4.5 mph, droplets can travel that same 20-foot distance, in just 1.6 seconds, and remain suspended at heights from 40 to 65 inches. The conclusion to be drawn is that viral droplets, let alone aerosol clouds, can be easily propelled to travel substantial distances, and remain suspended at heights, such that they may be readily inhaled. This case study illustrates the sheer magnitude, and swift nature of, how a viral outbreak can occur, the inherent dangers of high-density workplaces, and why they are a high-risk source of viral transmission. Here, a single COVID-infected employee, working at a call center that employed 216 workers, caused 43% of his fellow workers to become infected and ill, within 15 days. Note that the infected person sat in the side of the office at the top of the illustration, and that most of those who became infected, represented by the blue chairs, also sat in this side of the office. Few of the workers who were seated on the opposite side of the office, on the bottom of the illustration, were impacted. The conclusion to be drawn is that employers would be wise to rethink the risks attendant to low cubicle, open offices, conference rooms, and project spaces. This case study illustrates the impact of airflow, caused by a heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system, on viral transmission. An infected person, seated at table A with 3 others, had lunch alongside 2 other groups, at neighboring table B, and table C. During the 75-minute lunch period, 4 of his table mates, and 5 others in neighboring table B, and table C, became infected. Note that the airflow, from the restaurant's heating and air conditioning system's vents, moved from right to left, from table C to A to B. This transmission is likely as a result of the turbulent airflow created by the system, as no table E or table F diners were infected, as they were seated out of the main direction of the airflow from the system's exhaust fan, on the other side of the room. This case study illustrates how COVID-19 transmission may be enhanced by a heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system, pushing virus-infected air particles as opposed to recirculating air through the system.
This exhibit was created from data compiled and provided by Professor Erin Brumage, from the University of Massachusetts, an expert who has appeared frequently on CNN, Fox News, and other national news outlets. This data can only be appreciated in the context of how it is that viral transmission actually occurs. Understanding that a person's propensity to become infected is the simple product of the amount of active particles he or she is exposed to, and the length of the exposure time, and that it only takes the inhalation of 1,000 active viral particles to become infected. Essentially, this exhibit illustrates the propensity for a person to become infected by coughing, sneezing, speaking and breathing. In each case, the chance of successful transmission is fairly significant, which helps to explain the ongoing, unabated rapid spread of COVID-19 in many countries. As has been noted many times, it is not if you will become infected, it is by how much. By example, a single cough can generate the release of 3,000 droplets, each having as many as 200,000 aerosol particles. As such, it can place as many as 6 billion infected particles into the air. Again, because it takes the inhalation of as few as 1,000 active particles to become infected, traveling at the rate of 50 miles per hour. It clearly does not take more than a few moments to become infected, whether directly or indirectly exposed. Likewise, speaking, can place as many as 40 million aerosol-sized particles into the air per minute. Here again, it would only take about 10 minutes of conversation to become infected. Even a COVID-positive person breathing nearby can infect someone within 20 minutes. Each of these cases provides more than ample evidence of the ease by which viral transmission can successfully occur.
Yes, as it relates to face mask efficacy, it is true. Size does matter. Barrier face coverings, as the name implies, are designed to help curb community spread by blocking microorganisms. Typically, they are not particularly effective in doing so, and it is not too difficult to understand why. As the arrow in the illustration points out, the size of the coronavirus is measured as a very tiny fraction of a micron, in fact, from only about 0.06 to 0.14 microns. And, while it is certainly true that COVID-19 typically hitches a ride on a larger droplet or aerosol particle, it is still an enormously small object that is difficult to filter or block. The white line near the center of the exhibit indicates the 2.5 micron measure that is often noted by many activated charcoal and non-woven filter manufacturers. We don't know why, however. Clearly, it is evident why these filters are not of much value in blocking the COVID-19 virus. Interestingly, the well-known N95 respirator device must only demonstrate that it is effective against 95% of particles that are 0.3 microns and larger. How then are these devices so effective against coronavirus-size pathogenic microbes? We will explain this later in the presentation. However, suffice it to say that it has something to do with the distinction between blocking and filtering. The topic of bioburden buildup and its inherent danger is one that is typically not brought up by most face covering manufacturers, and for good reason. In fact, as we see it, it is an unappreciated transmission vector that may be responsible for a significant amount of continued unwitting disease transmission, largely because it is unknown or misunderstood. To understand why, it is necessary to appreciate that COVID-19 has been found to remain active for as long as 7 days on certain surfaces, including some of the papers from which many face masks are made. As such, it is not difficult to understand why it is so easy for a large colony of viable infected microbes to accumulate. This is called bioburden buildup. Ordinary face coverings can create viral bioburdens when a COVID-positive face covering wearer's breathing, speaking, coughing or sneezing emits infected particles that collect on its inside layer. It also develops on the outside of a face covering when the wearer comes into contact with another person's infected particles which have been placed into the environment. The danger is that because viral microbes can remain active on a face covering for an extended period, those particles are subject to being inhaled by the wearer, or propelled by the wearer to infect others. This risk will continue, with each use, until the face covering is cleaned. Further, each time the wearer touches or adjusts the face covering, it creates the potential to contract and spread disease. The conclusion to be drawn here is rather simple: blocking viral microbes is not enough, they must be killed, to prevent bioburden buildup. The challenge of bioburden buildup is not a new one. Hospitals and healthcare systems have been dealing with it since the beginning of time, in the form of hospital-acquired infections, environmental contamination, and infection control and disinfection, on fabrics and surfaces alike. The good news is that there are effective means by which to inhibit bioburden buildup. In part, this is because all things have a positive, negative, or neutral charge. Many bacteria, germs and viruses, including the coronavirus, have an outer protein protective capsule that carries a negative electric charge. When this negatively charged virus encounters something that has a positive charge, the virus is inactivated, killed, electrocuted, as the case may be. Viral particles must be continuously killed, not just blocked, to inhibit bioburden buildup. There are two means by which to effectively inhibit its development: a chemical-based approach, and an electric-based one. The chemical-based approach employs an antimicrobial agent that is fabricated to pierce the viral microbe's protein capsule and disable it with chemistry, which is a nice way of saying, poisoning it. Note that most antimicrobials feature heavy metals, such as zinc, copper or silver. These are inherently noxious metals, and these metal-based antimicrobials work when their toxicity is essentially leaked to poison the virus's protein capsule. We believe that this is not the type of transaction that most people want performed just a few centimeters from their mouth. And far more effective and cleaner way to inhibit bioburden buildup is the electrostatic approach. This approach is based upon creating a triboelectric air filter, whereby the face covering's fabric develops a positive charge that, first, attracts negatively charged microbes, then secures them through the different polarities, and then finally electrocutes them. Most people are unaware, but N95 type respirator devices have a center layer that is charged at the factory with positive polarity. This positively charged electrostatic center layer is what actually makes them effective against virtually any size particle. Interestingly enough, a safe and sustainable positive charge can be created by both antimicrobial chemicals, and the use of fabric combinations, such that when they are rubbed together, they create a triboelectric charge, along the lines of what is commonly known as static electricity. This technique, and the science behind it, have been documented by research studies published by scientists from the Stanford School of Medicine, the University of Chicago, and the world-renowned Argonne National Laboratory. Indeed, reference to these studies may be found in the community face mask standards developed and adopted by many nations. As a prelude to our discussion of face mask efficacy, a valid question that might be asked is, why are we here today discussing general-purpose face coverings? Let's discuss the reasons why. To begin, unlike many other transmittable airborne diseases, COVID-19 is spread largely through asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic transmission, meaning that people who may be infected can transmit the disease to others unwittingly. Accordingly, a means by which to reduce community spread is necessary. N95 type devices, and other protective respirator type devices, are still very much in short supply, and we have been reserving them for first responders and healthcare workers. The production of respirator type devices, surgical and medical face masks, greatly taxes our supply chain, because the raw resources used to create disposable devices are in short supply. Likewise, the machinery used to create these devices is also in limited supply. On the other hand, there is no shortage of textiles, and it is not too difficult for garment makers and others to retool for mass production of face coverings. Lastly, until COVID-19 emerged, we did not use general-purpose face coverings very much. As such, there was no need to have regulatory guidelines for what were seen as non-medical devices. Today, now that general-use face coverings are in such wide-scale use, there is a need to create a regulatory framework for them.
Essentially, there are 4 face covering options available for general-purpose, non-medical use. N95 class respirators are often referred to as the gold standard of face coverings. The name derives from the requirement that they filter at least 95% of particles 0.3 microns and larger. There is no doubt, these masks work, and they work well. Unfortunately, they actually work so well that they often get clogged up within 10 hours of wear. And then, they stop working altogether. N95 type masks are disposable, and designed to be used only once, typically, for up to 8 hours. The fact is, these masks were never designed or intended for general purpose or extended use. It is well known that they are difficult to breathe through, especially for more than a few hours. They are predisposed to create a bioburden risk because they are typically used more than once. And their outer layer's material composition is prone to enhance bioburden accumulation. Because N95s are in short supply, they have become expensive, and they are generally reserved for healthcare employees and first responders. Used as intended, these masks are fairly expensive. At about $100 is an array of other types of so-called duck-billed face masks. These masks also feature an electrostatic layer, similar to that which is found in N95 type masks. These face masks are unable to create as tight a seal as N95 respirators, which are typically fitted to the wearer. As such, much more inbound and outbound air leakage occurs with these devices. The result is a lesser degree of both source control and wearer protection. In fact, the particle filtration efficiency levels of these masks range from 70% to 90%. As a result, they are much easier to breathe through over extended periods. Nonetheless, the masks suffer from the same bioburden-related issues as N95 devices. Designed for single use and to be disposable, if worn properly, they are more affordable at about $45 or procedure mask, is a device that was never intended for either source control or wearer protection. Yet, it is used for both. Originally designed and intended to be used to protect surgeons, while performing an operation, from anything that might be thrown about, their utility has been extended to use by healthcare employees, but only in non-infectious situations. These masks were never intended to protect against inbound pathogenic aerosols, and are only about 40% to 50% effective. Never intended to fit well, they generate considerable inbound and outbound leakage, and, as such, they offer little in the way of wearer protection. The materials used on their outer layer is prone to enhancing bioburden buildup, a risk that is exacerbated by their often being used repeatedly. Designed for single use only, and to be disposable, if worn properly, they are affordable at about $20 fabric general-purpose face coverings. These products vary enormously, in terms of quality, effectiveness, durability, safety, fit, comfort, and affordability. In general, they are worn to help curb viral transmission, as a means of source control. More recently, they have been determined to be a viable way to lessen the inhalation of infected air. Generally speaking, fabric face coverings can be from 20% to 70% effective at particle filtration and source control, depending upon the number of layers they have, the quality of its fit and seal, the material type and quality, any filters that may be employed, and if an effective antimicrobial treatment is used. Those that are designed and constructed to generate an electrostatic charge have been found to be materially more effective at the filtration of particles of all sizes. Of course, unless the face covering is treated with an effective antimicrobial that is capable of inhibiting bioburden accumulation, these masks must be washed daily, typically in high-temperature water, to avoid creating a significant bioburden risk. Designed to be used and washed daily, they are affordable at about $15 per month.
A great many false, misleading, and inaccurate claims are made about face coverings, with respect to their various properties, capabilities, and performance characteristics. Let's identify some, and dispel them, as this is critically important. These claims fall into two general categories, those that are related to efficacy, cost-effectiveness, and value, and those that are related to safety, health, and environmental impact. Of particular concern are claims that are made with respect to a face covering's effectiveness at particle filtration. This is because it is the measure that is most often relied upon by consumers to evaluate a face covering's effectiveness, and to compare one to another. Despite appearing to be a metric that cannot be tampered with, the fact is that there are several variables that may impact the results of particle filtration testing. Curiously, all of the test variables are within the requirements of the many international particle filtration test specifications. These variables relate to the type of particle used, its size, the polarity of the particles, the velocity at which they are projected, etc. The fact is that different testing approaches, related to any of these variables, could lead to wide variances in test results and findings that are often unreliable and misleading. Similarly, wildly inaccurate and misleading claims are made about the effectiveness, safety and environmental impact of antimicrobial treatments, and the validity of their supporting science and testing. Most of these tests are done by chemists in laboratory dishes, not on the actual face covering itself. Few are aware that metal-based antimicrobials actually require direct contact with the virus, which would require that the entire mask be metal-coated, and, of course, none are. Few of the antimicrobial chemical tests performed and promoted actually provide support for the claims made about them, but only a person, familiar with the technical details of these chemical tests, would see this. The topic of durability speaks to the issues of reliability, as well as cost-effectiveness and value. It is not unusual to see claims that a face covering is able to remain effective after 30, 40, or even 100 use and laundering cycles. Sometimes, these claims are supported by lab tests that appear to indicate that testing was performed after X number of washings, and these results are often rather convincing. Unfortunately, most face covering testing is typically not performed following the actual claimed number of laundering cycles. Instead, most manufacturers instruct their testing laboratories to follow laundering specifications that are designed to replicate the effect of multiple washings, and to not actually perform the claimed number of washings. One laundering specification is based on the premise that a single, 75-minute machine wash is the equivalent of 50 use and wash cycles. We do not believe this to be the case. In fact, we believe that these types of claims are misleading. Likewise, we believe that manufacturers that feature metal-based antimicrobial treatments should address the issue of their safety and inform the consumer that the finite reservoir of noxious toxins that is relied upon to poison bad microbes is indeed limited, and that it depletes over time, until it is no longer effective. This enormously important detail is rarely mentioned. As it relates to the issues of safety, health, and environmental impact, the false and misleading claims are more nuanced, and typically present themselves in the form of lying by omission. Many face coverings are made of noxious materials that are harmful to humans, and which actually enhance Bioburden accumulation. These materials include polyester, and many other synthetic fabrics. Heavy metal-based antimicrobials work by poisoning bad microbes. An unattractive and toxic process that again is not often mentioned. Many face coverings are coated with treatments that involve the application or use of nanoparticles. Others feature insertable filters that use activated charcoal, while still others use biocides and antimicrobial treatments that have never been used in a face covering application, where it will be breathed through for many hours per day, for days on end. The FDA, CDC, NIOSH, and several medical societies have all weighed in on the potential inhalation danger and harm associated with most of these substances. Further, environmentalists have long warned about the adverse impact associated with the disposal of face coverings that have been treated with various heavy metal-based and nano-sized particles. Face covering manufacturers rarely address any of these health, safety, and environmental issues. Lastly, bioburden accumulation is an issue that is rarely addressed by face covering manufacturers. This is disappointing in that certain materials, including polyester, and many other synthetic fabrics, enable positively charged microbes to remain active for extended periods of time, thereby enhancing viral sustainability, and creating more bioburden risk. Each of these false claims and myths serve to provide consumers with a false sense of security about the effectiveness of their face covering, and inhibit their ability to fairly evaluate and compare one face covering with another. These are some of the reasons why the new National Barrier Face Covering Standard was developed. The next 3 slides are of a face covering comparison grid that appears in our study, COVID-19, its transmission and face mask efficacy. The grid is available for download, as a part of that study, and as a separate document, at www.researchconsortium.org. This section of the grid identifies various purpose, construction, filtration and antimicrobial characteristics of the face covering. This section of the grid identifies other aspects of face coverings, including those related to fit, moisture control, breathability and airflow, whether latex and hypoallergenic materials are used, etc. This last section of the grid addresses the topics of reusability, durability, customization, value, etc.
2. Unprecedented, redundant, and concurrent multinational initiatives were undertaken, first, in Europe, and then here, in the United States shortly thereafter, both aimed at developing specifications for the manufacture of what are called community face masks, in Europe, and barrier face coverings, here. Begun early in 2020, and completed in record time, these parallel efforts resulted in a specification published by the American Association of Textile Chemists and Colorists, and a specification developed under the guidance of the French, and published by the European Commission on Normalization. It is important to note that specifications are not standards. Specifications are intended only to be voluntary recommendations, parameters, and guidelines. Adopted by the 26 members of the European Union, various versions of the specification were created by several countries, each to reflect the particular circumstances and preferences of that nation. By example, some countries condition the use of antimicrobial treatments, whereas other countries prohibit their use altogether. Several groups of nations, including the Islamic countries, the Russian Federation, the African Union, and other regional and international entities, have developed their own specifications. Over the past year, we have learned a great deal about face coverings, their effectiveness at helping to curb source control, and their ability to mitigate the inhalation of infected airborne particles. Today, we know a lot more about what works, and what does not. Accordingly, with this more complete knowledge, it was determined that it was necessary to convert the existing specifications into standards. Unlike specifications, standards are designed and created with the intention to be used as requirements that are incorporated into codes, regulations and laws, and, as such, they generate a greater degree of institutional, market, and community support. Understanding this, standards are developed by work groups that are comprised of individuals who represent a wide spectrum of the public, commercial and governmental interests, including manufacturers, end users, consumers, general interest parties, test lab, textile and chemical experts, professors, scientists, etc. The standards development process employs a consensus approach that ensures that the concerns of all parties are heard and addressed. Indeed, any one committee member can essentially stall the process until his or her issue is addressed, not only to his or her satisfaction, but to the satisfaction of the entire work group. It is a hugely democratic process. The development of the European standard was the result of converting its specification into a more formal standard. Although a perfectly good US specification already existed, the ASTM decided to develop its own standard, drawing from it as well as a variety of sources, rather than just one. These efforts resulted in the ASTM International Specification for Barrier Face Coverings, which was released on February 15. Essentially, it was developed at the behest and oversight of the CDC NIOSH division, and, in that it has already been adopted by more than one European country, it is already an international standard. Just 2 weeks prior to the release of the ASTM document, the Europeans released their new standard, the Flex 5555 Community Face Coverings Specification, version 1. This time, the European effort was led by the British, and the joint document was released by the British Standards Institute. In large part, the topics that are addressed by community face covering specifications and standards are fairly similar throughout the world, with some being more inclusive, or specific, than others. This exhibit identifies some of the metrics that we have used to compare specifications and standards. On the left, a number of standard respiratory filtration, breathability and other such tests are listed. On the right, the face covering's antimicrobial characteristics are identified and measured, as well as its fit, sizing, construction, comfort, durability and related features. Lastly, the face covering's care and use instructions, packaging and labeling requirements, and performance claims are typically addressed as well.
The primary purpose of the new barrier face covering standard is to increase the effectiveness of source control as a means by which to reduce community spread. Its secondary purpose is to increase wearer protection, by reducing the chance of inhaling infected air. Its objectives are to improve the quality of face coverings by establishing requirements, specifications, test methods and guidelines, for mask manufacturers. These pertain to product design, include certain leakage, filtration and breathability performance measures, and make requirements with regard to the product's labeling, user instructions, etc. These relate to both the face covering's ability to serve as source control, and its ability to provide some level of inhalation protection for the wearer. It is noteworthy to mention that these requirements were developed with adequate attention paid to ensure proper face covering fit and comfort, understanding that people will not wear face coverings for long periods of time if they are not comfortable, or if they do not fit well. Another objective of the standard is for it to assist consumers with making informed decisions about their face covering options, whether that consumer is an individual, or a large corporate buyer. To accomplish these objectives, the standard provides consumers with a set of performance measures that may be used to assess and compare general-purpose face covering options, using certain air filtration efficiency and breathability performance measures. The new National General-Purpose Face Covering Standard brings value in many ways. To begin, it established the first standard test method, and minimum performance requirements, to facilitate comparisons among different general-purpose face coverings. Second, the new standard will actually help to curb COVID-19 spread by reducing consumer confusion about what works, and what does not, as it relates to general-purpose face coverings. In addition to addressing the issues of fit, size, comfort, etc., it also attacks the issue of durability, head-on, by requiring that general-purpose face coverings be evaluated before, and after, the manufacturer's claimed maximum number of use and laundering cycles, while employing the manufacturer's specific laundering process. Unlike many specifications and standards, this document is purposefully minimalistic with respect to its product design specifications and requirements. This was purposeful, as the development committee did to want to stifle innovation as it regarded design. The general design and construction criteria require that the face covering cover at least the wearer's nose and mouth, that it fits snug enough to minimize gaps, that it have a retention system to keep it on correctly on the wearer's head, during a range of activities, and that it is sized to be fit and worn comfortably, by a wide spectrum of individuals. The standard provides for a few testing options as it relates to demonstrating fit, sizing, leakage, etc. These include a design analysis, a fit test and a quantitative leakage assessment that is intended to assess potential face covering leakage pathways.
This exhibit illustrates how face covering sizes are derived. Suffice it to say that there is a standard face measurement tool and specification that is used to determine whether or not the manufacturer's sizing is adequate to fit a representative population of wearers that the size is intended to fit.
The standard contains 4 distinct performance measures: source control, filtration efficiency, breathing resistance, and leakage. As this exhibit illustrates, by employing these 4 distinct performance measures, fit, leakage, filtration and breathability, manufacturers and consumers alike will be encouraged to seek optimal performance by taking each into consideration. Source control is the primary, number 1 purpose of the face covering standard. This performance metric is intended to measure the degree to which infected particles flow from the wearer, through the face covering, into the atmosphere. This is important as, ideally, face coverings should be designed to focus the stream of exhaled air, through the center section, so as to minimize leakage from the perimeter of the covering. Unfortunately, there is no proven means by which to accurately measure this type of airflow, and, as such, a face covering's effectiveness at source control is more qualitative, rather than quantitative, and design, fit, and leakage-oriented. Filtration efficiency relates to wearer protection against inhaling infected air. And wearer protection is the second reason for using a general-purposed face covering, behind source control. This test measures the degree to which infected particles flow through the face covering to be possibly inhaled by the wearer. More specifically, particle filtration efficiency is the measure of the percentage of submicron particles that are blocked by the face covering, in particular, those that are 0.3 microns and larger, the same size particle used in the testing of N95 devices. Indeed, this standard employs the much more rigorous, and far more discriminating, NIOSH-based test methodology. Rather than the very inconsistent and unreliable particle filtration test methods commonly employed by face covering manufacturers. This standard employs the same measuring scale, test methods and equipment requirement used to assess N95 devices, with some modifications, and requires performance efficiency of at least 20% to satisfy the standard's minimum filtration requirements. While this may sound low, especially when compared to test results that are often in the 90% or higher range, it is clear evidence of the far more rigorous filtration challenge this test poses. In addition to particle filtration efficiency testing, the standard provides for an option to supplement this test with a bacterial filtration efficiency test. This test measures the face covering's filtration efficiency against much smaller projectiles. The breathing resistance, or airflow, performance measure focuses on a face covering's breathability, in layperson's terms. It measures the resistance to air passing through the face covering, and the pressure differential between the inside and the outside of the covering. It is a measure of air inhalation, of air being pulled through the face covering. The test is performed on the same equipment as the particle filtration test. They are standard tests that have been modified to toughen NIOSH requirements. Leakage testing consists of both qualitative and quantitative measures that are intended to determine whether or not the face covering's coverage on the wearer's face is adequate, how well the face covering seals to the wearer's face, and to what extent it prevents particles from leaking around its perimeter. A face covering's propensity to create a good seal is evidenced by a manufacturer-created report called a design analysis, which can be either a dimensional analysis, computer modeling, head form fit and sizing study, or a quantitative analysis. The design analysis is intended to assess fit, identify potential gaps, and leakage pathways. It measures the leakage around and through the face covering and yields a leakage ratio. Although the standard does not presently specify a pass or fail measure. This report may be supplemented with an optional quantitative leakage analysis.
The standard's development process is an iterative one, and, as a result of the urgent need for a national face covering standard, this document is an imperfect and dynamic one that is subject to future expansion and improvement, over time. In terms of structure and format, the standard is disjointed and exceedingly difficult to follow. It uses very technical terminology, and is not always consistent. It is very complex, and overly technical, for anyone other than a textile, manufacturing or testing professional. Its performance measures are inconsistent with current industry norms with which consumers are presently familiar. This will likely cause some confusion on the part of consumers, who may compare the much higher results of less rigorous particle filtration tests, with this standard's NIOSH-based, far more challenging, ones. The scope of this standard is also limited, and it does not purport to address several safety, health, and environmental issues. Lastly, in terms of consumer concerns, the standard lacks warnings with regard to harmful, unsafe, and eco-unfriendly materials, finishes and antimicrobial treatments. It is noteworthy to mention, however, that the ASTM subcommittee that developed the standard will soon resume its activities to address each of the issues and topics above. This standard features two main performance measures that are likely to get the attention of most consumers, whether they be individual or professional purchasers. They are submicron particle filtration, and airflow resistance, or breathability. The results of these performance measures must be prominently displayed on the face coverings packaging and labels, as they are intended to provide the consumer with information that is adequate enough for them to evaluate the effectiveness of the face covering, and compare one face covering to another. As it relates to particle filtration, the performance measure is the NIOSH modified test that determines the face covering's effectiveness at capturing small particles, of 0.3 microns or larger. The minimum acceptable filtration rate to meet the standard's requirement is 20% or higher. Face coverings that achieve 50% or greater filtration rates are considered to be higher performance. The airflow resistance or breathability measure is less intuitive and straightforward, however, as the result is expressed in unfamiliar terms, millimeters of water, with minimum and higher performance levels. It is noteworthy to mention that there was considerable discussion and debate on the 20% and 50% amounts. The descriptive terms used, and the two-tier, rather than three-tier, gradation. The standard provides manufacturers with a great deal of leeway as it relates to how they wish to illustrate the performance of their face covering against the standard's minimum and higher performance levels. It does, however, provide a few visual examples of how this may be facilitated, including these three options. Note that here, the terms Level 1 and Level 2 are used to describe minimum and higher performance. Also note that the performance measure terms are simplified to filtration efficiency and breathability. Some have been critical of option 3 being overly simple, at the expense of providing important information. This is a more graphic representation of the standard filtration and breathability performance measures. Here again, notice the use of different and inconsistent terminology. The term lower has been replaced with low. The term higher has been replaced with high. The standard's text refers to the 20% filtration level as the minimum acceptable level to satisfy the requirements established by the ASTM committee, in consultation with NIOSH. Some experts believe that the terminology used in this exhibit suggests that the 20% filtration level is to be interpreted as low performance, rather than minimum performance. Likewise, this exhibit suggests that the 50% filtration level is now high performance. It will be interesting to see how it is that manufacturers and consumers understand, adopt, implement and employ these and other visual representations of these two performance metrics. One of the intended purposes of the new standard is to ensure that consumers are provided with the information and data they need to evaluate and compare general-purpose face coverings. In large part, this is accomplished through some rather detailed requirements for manufacturers as it relates to furnishing purchasers with comprehensive user instructions and product labeling. Certain product labeling requirements apply to its packaging, while others apply to the label affixed to, or printed on, the face covering itself. It must be on the product's smallest saleable unit or package. Information must be provided that describe how each size is defined, as well as how the user should select the correct size, or how the face covering may be adjusted to accommodate the wearer, as the case may be. The standard requires that filtration efficiency and breathability test performance results be clearly displayed, as well as user instructions on how to put on and take off, store, and dispose of the face covering. Detailed laundering instructions must be provided that describe exactly how the product should be laundered, the frequency, and the maximum number of launderings the face covering is claimed to be able to endure without any degradation in construction, durability, or performance. When the face covering should be replaced, as well as how it should be disposed of, also need to be provided. A list of primary construction materials, the manufacture date, etc., are also required, if applicable.
Satisfying the new barrier face covering standard will pose significant challenges for many manufacturers. To begin, the standard is fairly difficult to understand. As such, many manufacturers will need to engage the services of a regulatory compliance consultant to decipher the document's many requirements, which are not very obvious to the untrained user. Second, the standard's requirements include filtration, fit, breathability, textile composition, and biocompatibility testing. Many of these tests are not typically performed by most labs. The specifications of other, more commonly performed tests have been modified for this specific application. Based on our survey of more than a dozen well-established testing laboratories, we found no single testing entity that is capable of performing all of the required tests. In fact, most labs are still trying to understand the standard, or to modify their capabilities to be able to perform the required testing. Lastly, the cost of performing the testing necessary to comply with the new standard is not inconsequential. Based on proposals that we have obtained, as illustrated here, the cost of testing a reusable face covering ranges from $19,000 to as much as $25,000. Testing single-use, disposable face coverings will be only about 10% less, as these coverings do not have to be tested after laundering. Indeed, for many small manufacturers, and those that temporarily retooled their manufacturing to help out with the masking initiative, this expense will be prohibitive. Accordingly, we believe that many face covering producers will likely drop out of the market rather than absorb this expense. One area where we believe the standard could use some serious improvement is as it relates to cautioning the consumer with respect to its scope and limitations, and what it does and does not address. At the Research Consortium, while we appreciate that efficacy, cost-effectiveness and value are important aspects of general-purpose face coverings, being safe, healthy, and eco-friendly are of equal concern to most consumers. For this reason, we have been lobbying and working with standards organizations and consumer groups across the globe, to encourage them to include in their specifications and standards, a requirement of a consumer advisory product label, like the one that the Research Consortium uses, in the promotion of our face covering product. Very simply, it states that most standards that regulate general-purpose face coverings do not address the use of antimicrobial or antiviral materials, finishes, or mechanisms that may substantially impact their efficacy and safety. That, and several aspects that relate to the material composition and design of face coverings, are not addressed by most standards. These, however, may warrant attention relative to potentially toxic finishes, inhalable substances from materials, bioburden inhibitors, etc. Our recommended consumer advisory goes on to note that it is important that end users to familiarize themselves with the specific special claims being made for these products, and that they ask for information to verify such claims. For most, this is not unreasonable language for a face covering label that is intended to inform consumers, and provide a level playing field for the comparison of products. Yet, unfortunately, that has in fact been the case. Now that there is a nationally recognized standard for general-purpose, or barrier face coverings, there now exists an important distinction as it relates to them. This is simply the distinction between being above standard, and being substandard. Prior to the issuance of this document, that distinction could not really be made. Written to be a standard, rather than a specification, that is designed to be incorporated as a requirement in codes, regulations and laws, this standard is likely to become widely adopted, endorsed, required and implemented by a wide variety of entities. Several federal agencies could adopt, implement and enforce it. As suggested by the group of experts and scientists that wrote to the Biden administration's pandemic task force, it is likely that the CDC will officially adopt and endorse the ASTM standard, as recommended. This, in and of itself, would constitute a substantial move in that it would call attention to the standard beyond the manufacturing audience, to the individual and commercial consumer level. In addition to federal OSHA, there are several state-operated OSHA entities, as well as a number of other state and federal agencies, including NIOSH, that have adjusted their regulatory guidelines to reflect the reality of dealing with a global pandemic in the workplace. Some of these changes were a direct result of the pandemic-focused legislation passed by Congress during the past year. It would be reasonable for these agencies to consider incorporating the requirements of this standard into their regulatory framework as they make these adjustments. It is also conceivable that the FDA finds a way to incorporate various requirements of the standard in its regulations and requirements for certain masks, by expanding its scope to include dual certification of a hybrid form of face covering, that could be used in certain medical and healthcare settings, under certain circumstances. It is likely that several states will adopt, implement and enforce the standard, in various ways, shapes and forms. By example, several states will most certainly impose a requirement that the general-purpose face coverings that are purchased for their employees, meet the new ASTM standard. It is also possible that some states may require meeting the ASTM standard to sell the face covering in that state. Certain European countries have done things along these lines. Insurers have been very involved with guiding their customers through various phases of the pandemic. At the same time, they have had to adjust their coverage guidelines to reflect new and unforeseen exposures that never existed in the past, and transfers in liability and exposure that have occurred as a result of court or executive order, or legislative fiat. The creation of a new standard that applies to an entire class of face coverings that are very often required in the workplace will likely cause insurers to pay attention. It is not difficult to envision property and casualty insurers, including liability and workers' compensation carriers, to adjust their policy language to include requirements to prohibit supplying other than ASTM standard face coverings. We believe that most private and public organizational purchasers will adopt the standard and classify all other face coverings as substandard. Moreover, many face covering manufacturers will find the standard's requirements to be too difficult or costly to satisfy, especially if it requires redesigning their product line, and they will most certainly drop out of the market. This will especially be the case for those companies that retooled their operations to make face coverings several months ago, and are in various stages of getting back to producing their core product. It will just not make financial sense for many of these manufacturers to retool their operations again to make what essentially amounts to a different product. Lastly, PPE purchasers will likely adopt the standard and classify all coverings that do not satisfy it as being substandard. The new face covering standard creates a variety of new employer risks and legal and regulatory exposures that will impact them in several ways, and have ramifications that are likely to be long-lasting. The adoption of a national general-purpose face covering standard immediately creates a new classification of employer-provided face coverings as being either at or above standard, or being substandard. Providing subpar face coverings will make the workplace less safe because they will not be as effective at source control, nor will they provide as much wearer protection against inhaling infected particles. In addition to putting the workplace at risk, providing subpar face coverings may foster a false sense of security at the workplace among employees, that may lead or contribute to an otherwise preventable worksite viral outbreak. Moreover, public-facing employees that wear a substandard covering could expose the business's customers to infection. For each of these reasons, employers should furnish only ASTM-certified face coverings. In addition to helping to foster a safer workplace, providing only ASTM-certified face coverings will likely reduce the organization's legal risk to face covering-related exposures. This is because furnishing subpar face coverings may create an unnecessary, yet foreseen, legal liability, and make it more difficult to defend against a lawsuit that claims that the substandard face coverings provided or contributed to an outbreak, etc. At the same time, we believe that it is entirely possible that businesses and organizations that furnish subpar face coverings may be found to violate, nullify, or limit certain insurance coverage provisions that require the satisfaction of all relevant community or business protocols or standards. As noted earlier, governor-originated executive orders, pandemic-related legislation enacted at the federal level, and laws enacted at the state level, have all served to complicate the compliance landscape for employers of all types and sizes. OSHA claims and violations have increased at an exponential rate, at both the federal and state levels. Maintaining a safe and hazard-free workplace is a dynamic process, in that workplace standards evolve over time. The creation of a standard for barrier face coverings, which will certainly be seen as the minimal acceptable quality level, necessarily implies that maintaining a safe and hazard-free workplace now assumes the use of only above-standard face coverings, and a prohibition against the use of substandard ones. Employers should no more expect to get away with supplying a substandard, general-purpose face covering, than they would for furnishing a substandard respirator. Many states, if not most states, have amended their workers' compensation laws in ways that transfer a greater degree of responsibility, liability and expense to employers. In many states, if an employee becomes infected with COVID-19, it is presumed that it occurred in the workplace, and it is a compensable action. Similar to the provision of PPE, providing above-standard general-purpose face coverings will be presumed, and to do otherwise will likely be deemed to have furnished a substandard device, by the local workers' compensation board, or insurance carrier.
Employers, looking to remain compliant with federal and state regulations, and to avoid or reduce any legal liability that may emerge as a result of the creation and adoption of this standard, would be wise to establish an enterprise-wide, general-purpose face covering policy, and to select, for exclusive use by employees and on premises, a company standard, general-purpose face covering, that, of course, meets or exceeds the ASTM standard's minimum requirements. A strong, comprehensive, and effective barrier face covering policy should present the facts, the logic and the reasoning behind the company's barrier face covering strategy. It should fully and explicitly describe the company's barrier face covering policy, including why it was created, when it applies, who must follow it, where it is in effect, etc. It should be as detailed as possible, and explain exactly what face covering can, and cannot, be worn. Ideally, it should identify one specific face covering as the company standard, and accept all others from use. It must provide instructions for correct face covering wearing, washing, maintenance, replacement, storage, and disposal, which should be consistent with the manufacturer's instructions. Although there is some doubt as to the effectiveness and enforceability of such, an employer may wish to have the entire face covering policy announcement and training process documented in writing, and to ask for employee sign-off.
As noted at the outset, after completing our research, we were unable to identify a general-purpose reusable face covering that we felt comfortable endorsing. Through our research, we identified all of the characteristics of face coverings that were effective and safe, as well as those that were not. And, as it turns out, no product on the market met our high standards. At the same time, our perspective on what should be expected from a community face covering was generally quite different from most, especially early on in this crisis. Our view was that in addition to serving as a means by which to control community spread, a face covering should also provide the wearer with a meaningful degree of protection as well. Further, we were focused exclusively on the effectiveness, fit, comfort, and durability of our face covering, and not its cost. Our thoughts were that it made no more sense for a person to purchase an inexpensive, yet ineffective, face covering in the midst of a lethal pandemic, to save a few dollars per month, when a much more effective alternative was available, and only slightly more expensive, over the course of its useful life. To us, it made no more sense to purchase a cheap face covering, than it would be to try to save money when purchasing a family car, by pursuing less expensive seat belts, brakes, or bumpers. The Research Consortium face covering was designed, and is intended, to be the finest of its type. It is founded on the creation of a fabric-based, self-sustaining, triboelectric air filter, that is intended to create a positive charge and to attract, secure and electrocute negatively charged protein-encapsulated microbes, of all sizes. This design derives from research and studies published by the scientist from Stanford Medicine, the University of Chicago, and the world-renowned Argonne National Laboratories. While we are not legally allowed to make any claims about the effectiveness of any antimicrobial treatments employed, especially as it relates to COVID-19, one version of our face covering features a decades-old antimicrobial, having characteristics that may be of interest and value to prospective purchasers. The inner and outer layers of our face covering are made with a proven, non-metal-based antimicrobial, that molecularly bonds to the fabric. It also creates a positive electric charge that has been shown to be effective at attracting, securing, and electrocuting negatively charged, protein-encapsulated microbes, of all sizes. As such, this version of our face covering features two redundant means by which to kill pathogenic microbes, and inhibit dangerous bioburden accumulation. In this regard, it is unique in the market. Each of our face coverings features seaming, strong parameter binding, a nose form, and two highly adjustable ear loop devices, all designed to ensure a tight, yet comfortable fit. Our face covering is presently being lab tested against the new ASTM standard. We know from experience that it is highly breathable, and, based on the previously noted research studies, we expect it to be extremely effective at particle and bacterial filtration, and leakage control. A battery of specially designed chemical testing, focused on assessing our face covering's ability to inhibit bioburden accumulation over its entire useful life, are also being conducted by an international accredited laboratory.
Unfortunately, we must advise you to beware of false claims of compliance with the new general-purpose face covering standard, as there are several manufacturers and promoters that are misleading the public. The fact is that even before the standard was released, manufacturers were claiming compliance with it. Some have even made claims that ASTM certified their mask, despite the fact that ASTM doesn't certify products. Most of these false claims are based on the use of faulty performance measures and the failure to complete the standard's testing requirements. This unseemly behavior is able to occur because the ASTM standard allows manufacturers to determine or represent compliance with all of its requirements. Despite the fact that only certified labs can perform the required tests, it is actually up to the manufacturer to be forthright about obtaining them and representing the results honestly. Some simply do not. Presently, ASTM has no mechanism by which to police those that falsely make compliance claims. It is, however, considering the development of a registry of compliant manufacturers, which may be maintained by OSHA or NIOSH. Don't buy substandard face coverings that may put your employees or your workplace at risk by trusting manufacturers. Demand proof of compliance in the form of test results, reports, leakage analysis, etc. Lastly, do not trust all media reports about this standard and the products that claim to be compliant with it. This false NBC News report, by example, is emblematic of those that have not been carefully researched. Thank you for viewing our presentation. We hope that it was of value to you. Please go to www.researchconsortium.org to download or read our face covering study and articles, and to learn more about the Stay Safer reusable protective face covering, and the science and technology behind it.